It would help me a little bit if I knew from among this group how many of you were present in our morning session. Okay. That presents a little bit of a dilemma because Jerry asked me to review briefly some of the things that we covered this morning, but I'm going to do that very, very quickly. And any of you who want some expansion on that will, perhaps if you can hang around, we can cover that afterwards if indeed there's time at that end, because we're going to be in a little rush for getting to the airport. But Jerry tells me that we have until 3 o'clock, and I'm going to try to police myself a little bit more than I did succeed this morning in allowing for questions. I'd like to cover a few things. One, about maybe 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes on what is this business called community policing and the struggle we're having with that, and the general picture of problem-oriented policing, and then get very quickly into a critique with you of some of the pluses and minuses that are happening with regard to problem-oriented policing. And then I'd love to be able to push through to some new thoughts I have as to where we're going from here if we have the time. I apologize for what's going to be a very rushed push through this first material, but just to share with you some of the things that I discussed this morning. Essentially, the point I tried to make is that we are handicapped currently by the fact that we are throwing around labels: community policing, problem-oriented policing, neighborhood policing, zero tolerance, broken windows, etc. And everybody has different understanding of these terms. And so the dialogue is very difficult. You and I could be talking about one of these labels, and we have entirely different things in mind. And there are places where community policing has totally revolutionized the way in which the police department is operating. And there are places where community policing consists of putting an officer on a bicycle, and the department will say, we've got community policing. Or putting 2 or 3 officers in an area, and the rest of the department continues to function in every way as they used to, and there will be a claim that we have implemented it. And I must say the federal program to some extent has promoted that, because in order to get money you have to say you've got it, and so we've got some very superficial implementations of these concepts. So one of the things I tried to emphasize this morning is that for those of us who are seriously interested in these concepts, we've got to get beyond using the labels. And I tried to identify this morning 9 different points that I have up here where to dig in from just saying we got community policing and start spelling out some of the elements of what we're talking about. And I have been working on this, and I've got another formulation which I'm not going to have time to present to you, in which I've developed those elements under each of these things. And the point I'm trying to make is that every community ultimately has to make judgments for themselves as to what they're trying to implement. And to forget about the notion of a federal concept of community policing, but what is your plan in your jurisdiction? And to constitute that plan by a coordinated, integrated collection of the various elements that would come under each of these things. So picture, if you will, each one of these 9 points having maybe 8 or 9 choices underneath them. And you go through like a smorgasbord and say, well, in our jurisdiction, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And let me just illustrate it briefly. Like in redefining the police function, most of these concepts mean that you're going to broaden it. You're going to tell your officers that we're going to do some things now that we didn't do previously. Certainly we're not going to just be limited to crime control. We're going to deal with quality of life offenses. We're going to do other things. There are other jurisdictions that be reluctant to do that. How far do you go? When, at what point do you say, this is not a police job? That judgment's going to be made differently in different jurisdictions. So under number 1, you would go down through here and say, yeah, we're going to do this, but not this, and this, and not this. Likewise, the capacity of the police. Are you taking the position that the capacity of the police is very limited, or that the police do have the capacity to deal with crime, and because each of those will take you along different routes? To what extent are you committed to researching and looking and analyzing your workload and the kind of problems you're dealing with? Some departments have no such commitment. Others have a very deep commitment along those lines. Number 4, you recognize this as the business of partnerships, that is, enlisting the assistance of others. But partnerships in some places consist of 2 police officers going to a meeting once a month. And partnerships in other places means really struggling and working with neighborhood groups and community organizations and giving them authority and giving them power and getting them involved in day-to-day business of the police. So under 4, there are different options that you could pick out. The use of the criminal justice system. To what extent are you going to continue to depend upon that? And to what extent are you going to look for alternatives to the criminal justice system? Everything from use of the civil law, making SEPTED kinds of operations where you're changing the physical environment, making use of conflict resolution and mediation, and all of these other new techniques. Under 5 is critical because it's the definition of the strategies police use and whether they go to something with 1 tool or they go to an incident and they have 15 different tools with which to handle the incident. The degree of discretion. How much discretion are you going to recognize with your police officers from a very narrow control, very broad? Acknowledging the legitimacy of community control. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make there is that some departments say, yes, we've involved the community, but they're not going to tell us what to do. We're going to set that priority. So they're very limited in what authority they're giving to the community and their involvement, whereas others feel we haven't really got to a partnership unless we give our partners some say in setting our priorities and in fixing our budget and in getting deeply involved in how we're going to operate. And then in 8 and 9, we have the corresponding kind of changes in the organization and in personnel practices to support all these things above. So, if in a department in which you've redefined the function and you're enlisting others and you're putting officers out in the street in specific neighborhoods to develop relationships with, that community, you're going to have major changes. You've got to have major changes in your internal organization in order to support those things. In the roles of supervisors, in reward systems, and also you're going to have changes, as in number 9, in personnel practices in terms of the type of officers you want, the training you give them, the way you evaluate them, etc. So I hope very, very briefly here what I've conveyed by this is a sense that the time has come in all these innovations and change for us to move away from the labels, which really complicates our communication, and to start talking about, in a micro sort of way, about the second and what I call the tertiary ways of defining what it is we're doing, recognizing that what works for one jurisdiction will not necessarily work for another, that police departments are at different stages when they begin this. Some are very backward and have to start doing elementary sorts of things. Others are very advanced and they can build on their progress to date and move much further into some of these different elements. And I would hope the day would come not before long when we can engage in discussions in which we are talking about the elements that go into the proposals rather than the broad generic sorts of umbrella terms. Now, it's in this context that I have been working on problem-oriented policing, and here I'm just going to very briefly review the basic element of that so that I can get into a discussion of what we're trying to do and how it relates. I have just said, essentially, don't pay attention to the big labels so much like problem-oriented policing, so I have to explain that what my role is to contribute to this debate. I've done so through trying to develop that concept, but I've always done so very cautiously, arguing that in order to present it, I have to present it as a coherent scheme, but that departments are in a position to adopt and adapt and extend the various elements of the concept. The basic, and very often I get categorized as promoting community policing. There are elements of community policing in problem-oriented policing, but you lose the major thrust of it if you put it in that kind of context. Because when I talk about problem-oriented policing, I'm talking about a fairly radical change in the way in which we think about the police job. And it's radical for this reason. The traditional posture of the police has been that given the mandate by statute, use the criminal law, get the job done, they've been very much a part of the criminal justice system. Police officers are defined as law enforcement officers, so that is seen as the central theme of policing. To deal with crime, you move from, you're given the authority, which is the means, you're a law enforcement officer, and you try to carry out this function of controlling crime and engaging in law enforcement. And whatever the reality is, my impression is that an agency that has that kind of orientation sort of molds everything into this basic concept. And that's why in the past, I've been working now in policing for 4 decades, and when I first went into the Chicago operation in the 1960s, working with O.W. Wilson, our goal was, let's get rid of all these darn jobs that we have, like picking up stray animals and dealing with drunks on the street so that we can concentrate on crime in this city that has lots of crime. And we tried to get rid of all these things. And then we've gone through, I've seen a complete revolution over a period of 4 decades in which we're saying, wait a minute, we don't want to give away all that stuff because that has various purposes. It's all very interrelated. It's not so easy to get it done by others. And there's 100 reasons why we perhaps should face up to the fact that this is the police job and we should try to do it in a more effective sort of way. So what was peripheral in this concept has to a certain extent become central. So this is the model that has existed and which we've played with over the years. What we are proposing in the context of problem-oriented policing, and you know, is first of all that they switch these two things around. You notice the means is up there, the function is down here. Here we put the function up on top, and we've had the means here. The logic of that being that this first thing is sort of, in the vernacular, sort of ass backwards. If you go from the means to the function. If you turn it around and you go from the function to the means, you say what it is that we do and how can we best do it. Now that's an almost embarrassing question in policing because we don't very often ask that. And when we start asking what it is that we do, we not only are dealing with crime, but we're digging into those thousands of other things that police do. I remember doing a study of the Detroit Police Department in the 1950s, and they had a tabulation of their activity. And it would be something like homicides, 500, robberies, 2,000, burglaries, this. And down the bottom they had miscellaneous, 95,450. And say, well, what the world is all that? Well, what we've been doing is digging into that to take it apart and to analyze it because we have discovered over these years that the public values that. And we were making an error in just discarding it or throwing it aside on the assumption that the police just deal with crime. So we are facing reality here in trying to look at the police function. It varies enormously, I've discovered, from one jurisdiction to another. And the best way I can describe it is dealing with community problems. So that's my unit of the various problems together constitute the police function. And then because if you're taking this fresh approach, here rather than just defaulting and say we use the criminal law, we engage in systematic analysis of each problem. It's an analysis, it's a thought process, some would call it research, to take on each specific problem police are dealing with. They're dealing with drive-offs from self-service stations. How many drive-offs do we have? Who drives off? How does it differ from one station to another? What can we do about it? The fact that a person is driving off without paying. Of course, how often does it happen? How is it spread out around the city? What have we tried to do to think through the whole problem of people driving away from service stations without paying as just a piece of police business? And then analyzing that and thinking through various new methods by which we can deal with it, what I call custom, tailor-made sort of responses to the problem of drive-offs. Now, one of these might be trying to apprehend the person who drives off, but that would be only one. There might be other ways of dealing with it. It might be the time has come for that particular station to have a policy of just prepay, so you eliminate the drive-offs. There may be other ways of dealing with the problem. But we are opening ourselves now to considering these alternatives. Another way of putting it is I'm trying to take the complicated job of a police officer and give to that officer more than just one tool, which is criminal law enforcement, give them a whole range of alternatives by which we can get the job done, many of which hopefully would be preventive rather than after the fact. And this opens up a whole area of initiative, inviting initiative and creativity in thinking through outside the box what we might do in dealing with specific problems that arise in the community, repetitive problems that come up over and over again. So you see what we've done here, essentially, is to redefine, to redefine the thing. So we look at the police job as consisting of a whole range of problems, pulling one at a time out for analysis, and then thinking that through in terms of the method we want to use, these just being 6 or 7 of maybe 50 or 100 different methods that can be employed in trying to deal with the particular problem, with the emphasis that criminal law remains one of them. That's a very brief sort of summary of the major thrust of what we've been trying to achieve through problem-oriented policing. I'd like to stop for just a few minutes. And any questions about that? Any way I can help to clarify it? Okay, well, how has this been implemented? And what are some of the problems? One of the first difficulties that we've had is in the use of the term problem. Now, I use it to describe the substance of policing, the things that the community looks to the police to handle, the business of policing. Complaints about people loitering for purposes of drugs, the sale of drugs, missing kids, noise complaints, the things the police are called upon to handle. And if you reflect on it, while we've given a lot of attention to the development of the policing profession, much of it has been focused on how we organize departments and how we staff departments and how we operate. And many of our operations are generic in terms of the patrol operation, the investigative operation. But we haven't spent as much time as we should on the substance, on the problems themselves, because I'm convinced from talking all these years with practicing police officers that there's an enormous amount of expertise in the policing field. A police officer who's a thinking police officer responds to the same kind of call once, twice, 10 times, 15 times, 100 times, says, you know what we should do about this? We should do A. We should do B. They've got lots of ideas about how to deal with these problems. And sometimes it's apparent to the police. Sometimes other people have the ideas. Sometimes you just blow the whistle and say, what could we do about this? You get some very effective and valuable suggestions about what we can do. And some of them are very sophisticated. Some of them are really just elementary. I was meeting with a group of officers recently, and sometimes it's a sort of dangerous kind of thing, but with your police officer you say, what's a common problem you run into? And they'll throw you a real Lulu, but it's hard to deal with. But let me give you two examples. I did this in one city, and they said, aluminum theft. I said, aluminum theft? Well, at that time, I didn't even know what it was. And they said, well, this happened to be in Milwaukee. And in Milwaukee, which is a very neat city, and sort of Germanic, and everybody has everything in control and in order, people were taking aluminum doors off of these small residential homes. We got lots of homes lined up on the street, individual homes, and the aluminum storm doors, which we have to have in Wisconsin because of the cold weather, were just disappearing. And that was a big, big problem because people, as you know, get very unnerved if somebody breaks into their house. And somehow, symbolically, if you take the door off their house, they feel, geez, my privacy, my home has been hurt in this. Not only was it the doors, but it was, they were taking aluminum siding off of houses. And it quickly turned out, as we got into this, that it was a juvenile problem because, for one thing they knew, because the siding would only be stripped up as high as the kids could reach. And they would take all that stuff down to the local junk dealer and sell it because the price of aluminum was pretty good. And so this was in a district, in a precinct, and we said, well, what are we doing about it? And everybody sat back. They said, what are we doing about it? We're taking reports. And then one officer said, I said, do you have a response for that? I said, yeah. He says, I'll tell you what my response is. My response is the hey you response. I said, what's the hey you response? He says, I see a kid walking down the street with an aluminum door, and I go and I say, hey you, come over. And he comes over to the squad. I said, where'd you get that? Oh, just found it in the lot up the street. What are you doing? I'm taking it down the junkyard. Going to trade it in. The doors weren't marked or anything. There was no way to trace them back. But this was once we got the group together, I said, geez, I've had 10, 15 of those in the past month. I had more. And it became apparent that they were just handling this by filing reports. But nobody had thought about the problem of aluminum theft. And they finally got all the guys together. They collected the information. They analyzed it. And they got insight into it as to why the people were doing it. And they explored who are these scrap dealers? Are they licensed? Are they just free to take this? And what might we do about it? And then they explored different ways of dealing with it, from applying some of the concepts we have with regard to like pawn shops to it, in terms of requiring them to register, maybe not permitting them to take stuff from kids. Requiring that if they leave it there, they can't get paid right away, but a check will be sent to them in the mail, and labeling the doors. The officers went to the hardware stores to find out how big the problem was, because how many people are coming back here constantly? And the hardware people said, all the time, they're constantly coming in here to replace their storm doors. They went to the insurance companies. What's your policy with regard to this? Do you have any disincentives, for the arrangement? So they collected a massive information to deal in a rational, direct way with the problem of storm doors. So that's a typical kind of substantive problem. And you can go through policing, and it'll vary as to what the problems are of the day. Now, what's the problem? What's the difficulty? The difficulty is that you use the term problem, and people say, oh, do I have problems? Problems that the squad cars don't start in the morning, that's my problem. So when I go to a conference now, I talk to officers, says, oh, you've implemented problem-oriented policing. They say, yep. We had this project in which the guys and gals were complaining about the quality of their uniform. So we made that the problem, and we focused on that, and we applied the Sarah model, and we solved the problem of the uniform. Now, there's nothing wrong with that way of thinking, but that's not quite what we're focusing on. Let me give you three other illustrations. I sat in on a training program on problem-oriented policing, and the officer talked about a problem employee, a dispatcher, who was taking an enormous amount of sick leave. and they discovered she had a problem with her leg. And so he's telling the class, he says, we applied the Sarah model, and we discovered that we could give her a stool. The pain in her leg went away, and the problem was solved. Well, fine, blessing on you, for doing it. But that takes us off track. We all have problems. Some of us have problems getting up in the morning. Some of us have problems deciding what we're going to wear or clothes. We have problem police officers. And we are in an age in which problem solving is generic. People go to marriage counselors and they say, we're going to solve your problems. We're going to solve your financial problems. So there's lots of problem solving going on in the community. I wish I didn't have to use the term problem, because it's subject to that kind of dilution and distortion. But the emphasis has to be on the substantive problem that is presented to the police department, like aluminum theft, any one of the other things that you have to deal with out on the street, whether it's domestic violence, residential burglaries, car theft, theft from cars, etc. And it has to be defined very, very, very specifically. One of the other things is, when we originally proposed this, we were talking about analyzing problems citywide. So we would suggest, look, your police department, if bicycle theft is a problem in your community, let's look at bicycle theft. How many? Where are they being taken from? Why are they being taken? It's a hell of a big difference if you've got a problem where people are stealing bicycles, putting them on a truck, taking them down to the border and selling them, versus bicycles that are being taken by juveniles just for transportation, to get from one place to another, or because they see a bicycle that's better than anything they've been able to afford, and so they just want an upgrade. The motivation will distinguish the kind of problem, and distinguishing the problem will tell you what you've got to deal with and what might be an appropriate response to bicycle theft. But there has been relatively little analysis at citywide level. I can almost count on several hands the number of projects we've had where a police department has said, let's look at this citywide. Where problem solving has taken hold in a way that is just epidemic is at the beat level, down here. It's in part because it's been given a boost by community policing. So you have an officer out in the neighborhood, and they say, well, what do I do now that I'm out in the neighborhood? And they say, in the context of community policing, you solve problems. So I've got a tavern or a bar that is giving us difficulty. I'm going to take on that bar and figure out what's going on there, who's causing the problem, and then I'm going to blast through to all kinds of alternatives for trying to deal with that, other than just trying to make arrests. That's commendable. And it's very exciting. And it's given new life to some officers who were bored on the job and said, just arresting doesn't do it. And I appreciate this confidence, this trust that's been placed in me, and I'm going to try to carry it out and do something. And if the department is rewarding that, I can't tell you what it produces. At the annual POP conference in San Diego, they make annual awards for good problem solving. And the officers come there who have been selected as the winners with such an enormous sense of pride. And they make their presentation to a large group of hundreds of other officers about how they, using the Sarah model, they analyzed the problem, they thought it through and developed different kinds of responses, put it in place, evaluated it, etc. And they have some nice, neat packages. But the point is that most of the problem solving has been done down here, and as a consequence, it suffers some from the lack of rigorous analysis, because officers don't have it within their capacity to analyze problems in as much depth as we had anticipated if the problems were analyzed up here. Our image up here was that a department's research and planning unit would do the research, and they would do it very, very rigorously, and they would evaluate it very rigorously, and the results would be made available beyond that, just to that department, shared nationally, And you would be able to say, this was a new approach that was put in effect based upon careful analysis. Moreover, we have an evaluation of it. It works, and we can recommend it to others to do. So we need much more in the way of department-wide analysis. There are some departments that have done much more of this than others. I don't pretend to be able to tick them off, but the interesting thing is that this concept has gotten a great deal of attention elsewhere, outside the United States. And maybe because they're not as pressured and as we are here, but some of the best models of problem-oriented policing have developed in a few other places, like in the United Kingdom, where there are 3 of the 48 police forces that are pretty much running as problem-oriented policing agencies: Thames Valley, Leicestershire, and Surrey. And then in the Netherlands and Sweden, in Spain, and in Australia, where it has taken off and is being done, but once again, largely on the beat level. An example of a department-wide effort would be one in Thames Valley Police, where they just got tired of dealing with shoplifting, and they analyzed it, and in their jurisdiction, after they discussed who was doing it, what they were doing, under what circumstances, in one subunit of the department, in Milton Keynes, they have the largest shopping malls of all of England. So they have the most shoplifting there. And in those units, they have developed a new system where they've applied restorative justice to shoplifting problem. As an aspect of community policing, they've engaged all the merchants in the process. And when somebody is arrested, as a teenager, they're given the option of, after being issued a notice, summons, whatever, of meeting with the merchants. The merchants and the kids then talk to each other about the problem, with the merchant impressing on the students what impact that has on his business. Not on the student, on the offender. And the offender, understanding this, making some commitments, and out of these have developed not only a commitment on the part of the community of merchants to dealing with that problem themselves, but some excellent rehabilitative efforts have been made, including some of these people being hired by the merchants to work for them after they've established a relationship. The Home Office has rigorously analyzed that program and has concluded that the incidence of recidivism in shoplifting among teenagers has dropped a great deal for those who have gone through the program as compared to those who did not and were dealt with in a regular manner. I spoke about analysis and the absence of adequate analysis in the SARA model. When you try to implement problem-oriented policing department-wide, and especially if it's a large department, it's understandable that unless you have engaged in a substantial amount of training, that officers on the beat just may not get it. So here's an example. I was sitting in on a meeting where the head of the operation trying to implement it was working with some commanders, and he was reviewing a few problem-solving efforts that had been launched in that particular precinct. And he was trying to impress upon them that some of the efforts were incredibly superficial. So he zeroed in on one of them in a way that was a little embarrassing. They had this form, and the form said, "What's the nature of the problem?" And the officer had recorded that the problem was illegally parked vehicles. And then the officer, without much in the way of analysis at all, skipped down and said, how was he responding to it? And the officer said he was issuing summonses. Well, on its face, they said, hey, wait, this is nothing more than the same old thing. You got a problem? What's the violation? Let's do something about it. And you issue a ticket. So to make an example of it, the person in charge said, illegally parked vehicles. Tell me more. What's going on? And he pulled his just tease this out of the individual. Says, oh, they're cabs. They're cabs, okay? And what's illegal about it? Well, a cab is a commercial vehicle, and this is a residential area, and they're parked on the street for several hours. Well, 2 cabs, 5 cabs, 10 cabs. The guy says, no, hundreds of cabs, hundreds of them. This was a very large city. He says, well, hundreds of cabs. Tell me more. How is this happening? He says, well, everybody knows what's going on. He said, this happened to be Chicago. And in Chicago, the cab drivers, there's a large percentage of all the cab drivers are recent immigrants from Pakistan. And most of the Pakistani people reside in one section of Chicago. And the arrangements, it turns out, for being in the cab business these days is that you rent the cab for the day as a driver. You push it as much as you can to try to make money, to pay off your rental. And then whatever you can make beyond that is yours to keep. And so these people, being industrious immigrants, were pushing these cabs as long as they could keep their eyes open. And then they would go home, get a few hours of sleep, and get back in their cab and take off. And understandably, they'd mostly come home at 12, 1, 2 in the morning, and they'd get up at 4, 5, 6 in the morning and get back on the road. Well, the person in charge still wasn't satisfied. He says, well, okay, I understand all that. Do we know how many and all that? No, he hadn't plotted it out or anything like that. But I'm not satisfied yet. What's the problem beyond it's being illegal for them to park the cars? He says, enormous problems. Tell me more. And he had to tease all this stuff out of him. He says, well, first of all, he says, this is, and then he described what essentially was sort of a broken windows phenomenon. This was had been a residential area. There were a lot of racial tensions because of the newcomers who had moved into the area. The people who previously lived there and had invested in the area resented very much all these cabs on the streets. They couldn't find parking spaces. And there were a lot of racial tensions that had developed because of this. The owners of the properties were saying the value of our property is going down because this place has been turned into a parking lot during the night. And moreover, there were assaults. Because when these people were coming home with their cabs, they would call ahead of time to their spouse and say, I'm on my way home from the loop. Go out and find a place for me. So the husband or the wife would be standing in this place, holding it for his or her spouse. And one of the regular residents would come along and try to park there. And say, you have no right to reserve that thing. I live in that house there. And so fights would break out about these individual things. So all this stuff was accumulating and was very important to understanding what the problem was. Well, we got all this out on the table, and then we pursued the question, well, what might we do about it? What's the cab company's responsibility here? Should they be providing parking? And if there is parking, where should it be? And then one of the officers raised his hand, he said, there's this corporation right down a block from the concentration of this stuff that has this big parking lot that is empty at night. It's packed during the day. Couldn't we somehow arrange for all these cabs to be parked there and the people transported, since most of them come home at the same time and leave at the same time? And so, and then what about our zoning laws? And should we make a change in the zoning law? They started exploring alternatives, which was a really fresh approach. But it was like pulling teeth to get people to think about that problem in an analytical sort of way. And now a lot of times individual officers do this on their own. And I got to tell you that it's just amazing. When I first got going in this area, if I might be permitted this one vignette, I got interested in this, and one of my early fans was Sir Kenneth Newman, who was the Commissioner of Scotland Yard London Police. And he grabbed onto this stuff, and and we did some work with the Metropolitan Police in trying to implement it in that very rigorous, very stiff organization. But he pointed out this one example. In London, on New Year's Eve, they have something like we have in Times Square, where at midnight, the ball falls down and everybody celebrates. And they had this one instance. Some of you around here, seeing a few gray hairs, will remember when this occurred about 12, 14 years ago. On a New Year's Eve, there was a big tragedy that occurred there in that right after midnight, everybody rushed for the underground. And in the course of rushing the underground, they were smashed. People smashed into each other in the little tunnels going down into the underground, and there were a number of deaths. And in typical London Metropolitan Police manner, they had a meeting of the type that you would picture in colonial England with people sitting around the table almost with pith helmets on, saying, what happened and what can we do for next year? They say, well, next year, no clowning around on the part of the officers. We'll have barricades in place. We'll have more police officers present. We'll issue more tickets. We won't tolerate any drinking. We'll do all these things. And in this meeting, there was just one Bobby who was the gopher. He was standing at the door to keep people out, and if anybody wanted to run an errand, he was going to run the errand. And he had the nerve, as this discussion was going on, to say to all these high-ranking commanders, did anybody ask the question, why did these people rush for the underground? They said, well, it's obvious. The last train was going to leave at 20 minutes after 12. And so the answer to this whole thing was not all the enforcement stuff. It was just thinking it through almost as a septet problem and saying, let's get the trains to run faster. Beyond that, let's make sure everybody understands that the trains will be running faster and they don't have to rush for the underground. So very, very often there are these alternative responses that come up, and very often it's the operating police officer who knows about it and can put it in place. There's lots of other problems we've encountered, but the one that I want to share with you is the lack of evaluation. That is, a lot of police departments are doing a good job. They're solving problems. They're coming up with alternatives, which in my heart I feel are good and effective. But they don't have any data to support it. And that's because a lot of departments are uncomfortable collecting before data, after data, so that they can say authoritatively that we did this and this happened. And so when we start putting these things on a computer and on the net so that other departments can use them, we find very often that we can describe what the department did, but we can't say authoritatively that it worked. And sometimes it's very simple to take a reading beforehand and a reading afterwards. There's several officers in San Diego who solved a street prostitution problem in a very creative way by getting, of all things, restraining orders and injunctions to prevent the most common prostitutes from being on the street. Had the thoughtfulness in advance to talk to the merchants in the area and found out what their level of business was, their pattern of how long they kept open, how much they invested in private security, and a few other things. And then they took the same reading a year later. Evaluations don't necessarily have to be abstract or scientific. Sometimes it's just recording basic information. And they were able to establish that profits went up, the use of the hotels and the stores was increased, that they were spending less on private security, that they were keeping open later. And it was very convincing. And it didn't take a rocket social scientist methodologist to establish those facts. So we just have to be mindful of the need to be able to say with some authority that putting some new program in place has some positive value. Now, this is really risky on my part, I'm going to use just a few minutes here to share with you what I think is a positive development. It's not a criticism of problem-oriented policing, that I'm trying to work on and collect information on because I think it pushes this concept further. and I'd be interested in your reaction to it, and then that'll take us to 2:30, and then we'll have a half hour for questions. In all this community policing and problem-oriented policing, and I've seen it in the problem-oriented policing area, when police get involved in these things, they discover, hell, if this shoplifter, for example, fraudulent theft by fraud in the context of shoplifting. When we have studied shoplifting in some jurisdictions, we discover the problem really isn't shoplifting. That's very often one of the things you find when you look into one of these things in depth. It's not what it's initially reported to be. The problem is not people who are taking stuff in the store and walking out the front door with it. It's people who are taking stuff in the store and taking it over to the register and telling the person, I bought this some time ago and I want a refund. So it's theft by fraud is the way it's described in many jurisdictions. Now, stores promote that by no-hassle return policy. We have stores that say, you bought it here, bring it in, we won't ask any questions, we'll pay it out. It's one of these things they can add on as a good advertising feature, and most people don't take advantage of it, so they pay out something, and they sometimes know that they're being taken, but it's a good policy. But what they then do is use the police to back it up. So they're using the police as part of their way of doing business. And when they do have one of these cases, they turn to the police, and you've got something to do. We know in that situation you can eliminate the problem by a policy of no exchanges without a receipt. So the question is, with all that police have to do, with all the problems we have in our society, when we know that there's an answer to a problem, to what extent should we push that answer as the way of dealing with it? Or do the police just have to sit back and say, you do business the way you want to do, and if you want to call on us, we'll do our thing? Now, taxpayers, very often, business people, will say, that's your job. And if I want to do business this way, and there's a crime, it's the police job. If I'm a landlord and I want to run my apartment house this way, not do a thorough check of my prospective tenants or anything like that, and that's my freedom. And if they then raise hell here, I got to turn to the police to handle the thing. Now, to put this in the larger context, you can see if you just picture, you're up in a helicopter and you're picturing society, and society is made up of people with varying degrees of responsibility and concern. You say, giving that kind of choice to everybody really makes the police sort of a dumping ground for all kinds of stuff that these people don't want to do anything about themselves, even though we know, were they to do it, they could prevent the problem. So when you're engaged in problem solving, very often you come up with an answer. And you say, my God, that would eliminate the problem. But the difficulty is, you can't, if it takes a third party to impose it, and they might conclude that they don't want to do it. So it remains yours. California police officers confronted me once saying that they have an enormous problem with the theft of computer chips. They feel they can greatly reduce the problem of computer chips if the companies that produce them put some kind of an identification on it. Now, the problem here is not just the theft of the computer chips. The chips are then used as barter. They're sent to foreign countries, and in return, drugs are sent here. So that problem is contributing to an influx of drugs. They go to the computer companies. Computer companies say, well, we've analyzed our thefts of computer chips, and it's not all that much. And it would cost us X to identify those things. So we're just not going to do it. And we've seen this show up in all kinds of things. Theft of vehicles. We know how to reduce the theft of vehicles, but the manufacturers are unwilling sometimes to implement these because they're operating on a profit-loss basis. Now, this phenomenon cuts across lots of things in our society. So one of the products of the problem analysis is we come up with answers, but we can't get anybody to implement the answer. And I can't live with the consequences of resigning ourselves to that, because that then means that police just accept defaults. You know, they just, if somebody is defaulting out there, they could do something about it, but we end up being the ones who have to handle the defaults. So what I see is happening, I've been charting some of the things that are happening in problem-oriented policing. And I think I've got it here somewhere. And I've discovered that there's a whole pattern of developments that involve what I call shifting ownership. In other words, what is happening is the departments that are getting involved in problem-oriented policing they're serving diagnostically as the agency that looks into the problem, which they're very well equipped to do. They analyze it, and they say, we could solve this problem by taking steps A, B, C, or D. But they don't have the resources with which to implement A, B, C, or D. Somebody else has to do that. So the issue then comes up, could police get themselves in a posture in which we broker ownership? We come up with information that says you can solve this problem by doing this, and then we tactfully, carefully, persuasively convince some other party that if they take this step, we can reduce the problem. And I've developed what I call a hierarchy of shifts in ownership. And if you think about it, a lot of policing falls into this pattern. Let me start from the bottom. And this is arranged so that we resort to this most commonly. We resort to the top least commonly. This is most intrusive. This is least intrusive. The top is most intrusive. And this is a very rough formulation of this, because this is something, we call it a work in progress. It's something I'm now playing with. But an educational program, we've been involved in this for a long period of time. We tell people you can lock your cars. If you lock your car, you reduce by some degree the potential for somebody else taking the car. We're constantly passing information on to people about how they can reduce the incidence of crime. Staying here in the university hotel, there's a brochure there that tells me how I can protect myself, just spending the night in the motel. That's a part of that. Then we move up in terms of what I call straightforward informal requests, where we're targeting somebody and we're saying, would you please do this, as a way of reducing the problem. The simplest version of this, you go to a call where there's a lot of noise, it's a loud stereo, but one neighbor doesn't want to talk to the other neighbor, and you go over to the other neighbor, and as you're the go-between, and you say, your radio is disturbing the people next door. Sometimes I say, oh my God, I didn't even know that was happening. You've made a straightforward request of them. They've taken ownership of the problem. It's on its way. And so we're constantly trying to shift ownership to the people who are producing the problem, which they may or may not know that they're producing. And then we move up a degree to targeted, what I call targeted confrontational requests, where we lay it on a person. We say, look, you're causing this problem. And at this point, there may be some implication that if you're not cooperative, we're going to have to take some further action. So you may confront a bar and tell them about what's happening in the bar and how you see them as contributing to the problem, and they may have to change their ways in order, with the implication that if you don't, we have to approve your license, etc. So it's a little more forceful, and it requires a little more on the part of the people involved. And as we move up, we talk about engaging another existing organization. That is, if you're in a situation in which you have a lot of homeless people who may be at a shelter at night, but they're required to leave in the morning, and they look for places to spend the day. They may settle in the local library. They may settle in a museum or a public facility, and then the facility, the library, starts calling and saying, we've got these people here, and it's a police problem. You've got to get them out. Working with that organization, engaging them, saying, look, you're going to have to develop rules on your own. You're going to have to train your staff so that we can deal with this problem, not by just ejecting them, but by being discreet. They have a right to use the library, but they don't have a right to make it their home. They don't have a right to use it as their toilet facility or for showering and bath and that kind of thing. And so the staff has to become part of the thing and take ownership for part of the problem. Pressing for the creation of new organization, that is, there's nobody there to work with to help create the organization. And we do a lot of that when we talk about the neighborhood, what do we call them? Neighborhood watches. We talk about, in my community recently, there was a big speeding problem on a certain street. The community got together, they organized, and they did a whole range of things, including promote a public relations campaign. They put up these things and they monitored the things that inform motorists about what speed they were going. They took ownership of the speeding problem. And in another similar situation, the police actually stopped the speeders, and then after they spoke with them or warned them, a member of the community would come up and speak to the individual to express to them their concern about their own children and why they had asked the police to engage in this. So the community gets involved in taking ownership. Public shaming is when you've dealt with a landlord who has ignored all the warnings. There's still a lot of problems going on, and you draw some publicity to the fact that house is creating problems in the community, and with the hope that the shaming itself will get the person to cooperate. One of the officers in the Leicestershire department in England, a beat officer in a neighborhood, discovered on analysis that 80% of his thefts were from cars in a parking facility owned by a particular department store. So with that information, he went to the owner of the store and he said, look, your accounting, or your current practices account for this. They did a lot of brainstorming, and they came up with the solution to the problem, which substantially eliminated it. As you move further up, we have situations in which, I mentioned drive-offs before. We tell drive-offs that, we tell the stations that unless you take step A, B, or C, we're just simply not going to respond to drive-offs anymore. You tell the merchant about bad checks that unless they do A, B, C, or D, we're just not going to take your cases involving bad checks. Now, let me emphasize, in all these situations, there's considerations. As you go higher here, it becomes more coercive. The cost of dealing with it for the people involved is greater. And also, you have to, in advance, do much more in the way of work to prepare so that your bosses and the city council and the mayor know the direction in which you're moving, so that you've laid the groundwork for taking some of these steps of these individuals who are drawing to themselves a disproportionate amount of police resources for things that they could do something about. And as you move up, up this thing, charging a fee for police service, a lot of departments have brought the problem of false alarms under control by imposing a charge for services. San Diego Police Department, an officer working in a problem-solving area in a mode in an area in which students lived, got the city council to enact an ordinance that said if after a warning within several hours the police had to return for a complaint regarding noise, etc., there was going to be a charge of $500 for the police service. It was enacted and still in effect, and they use it, and it's been very, very effective. Legislation mandating adoption of, there's a word missing here, of adoption of a preventive measure. That is, graffiti. In some jurisdictions, we mandate that spray paint, the cans, be sold under controlled circumstances, that they not just be on the shelves of supermarkets, that they be locked and sold only to adults, and all kinds of requirements of that nature. Legislation regarding titles on cars to reduce car theft. And there are a number of other things of that nature where a requirement, the enactment of a requirement has reduced the problem. And finally, at the top, when none of these other things work, they're saying, look, you're being a jerk, you're being an irresponsible citizen, and we're going to have to abate this drug house by declaring it a nuisance and take it away from you. We're going to involve civil enforcement. We're seeing a lot of things happening in that area where, for example, with regard to shootings, where there's an increased tendency to want to go back to the manufacturers of certain weapons and hold them accountable, to go back to motels that do not have adequate locked rooms and hold them accountable for crime that may occur on the premises. That's the extreme. But all of these things are methods of shifting. And I cite it here only as one example of one of the benefits that comes out of thinking in problem-solving terms, because once you explore the problem, it leads you to these kinds of conclusions, which you can then explore with the community as possible ways of dealing with the problem. Okay, I've squeezed a lot into this, but I wanted to get all that out. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, small, big. There isn't a question that is out of the ballpark. So I'd appreciate you raising it. Yes?
Yes, sir. I have two questions.
Yes.
Number one, how many of the regular... Excuse me, I didn't know I was going to...
That's all right.
How many of the regular police officers from what levels of command do y'all use when you establish such a program? And then I'll reserve the second question for after you're through answering that.
Okay. Enormous variation. There are some departments that created units that were just involved in problem solving, and everybody else went about their regular duty. I don't particularly favor that style, but that's one response. There are other departments that say everybody should engage in this. Some do, some don't. There are departments where when they engage in it, there's an understanding that if the officer has identified a problem that is far beyond his or her capacity to handle, it's much larger, that they nominate that for attention by the sergeant, who maybe have a larger geographical responsibility, or to nominate it for a lieutenant, or to nominate it to be dealt with by the chief. And we have seen that pattern move up. But the important thing is to get the middle management to be thinking in these terms, everybody in the department thinking in these terms, so that a sergeant and a lieutenant, in relating to their personnel, is relating not in terms of just control, you got to be on the job, you got to have a clean uniform, you got to do this, you got to do that, but what problems are you working on these days, and what can I do to help you in addressing those problems? And you get a whole dialogue going in the department, and you get an officer who says, hey, so-and-so up in the other area of town had that same thing, and let's find out how they dealt with it. And you get a lot of exchanges, especially given the potential for email communication, etc. What was your second?
Well, the second one, and it's going to sound facetious, and I don't mean for it to.
That's okay.
I don't mean to sound insolent with you, but the last point that you brought up was about doing things like under bringing of a civil action. You specifically mentioned bringing a civil action against gun manufacturers when their guns are used in crimes. And my question becomes, isn't that a little bit like bringing civil action against Ford Motor Company because a DWI person driving a Ford
misused the car?
Misused the car. Exactly.
Yeah. I recognize that there is that opportunity for seeing that, for an entirely different view of that, and I don't know enough about it to know whether it's desirable, undesirable, or it may well fall into that category. So I don't want to take that one example and press it. It's just the one that occurred to me as I was speaking rather fast, as ways to go back to some of the people who might be judged to be contributing to a problem, the judgment in that case may be that they had nothing to do with it, or you wouldn't be convinced of that. But there are other examples of, insofar as liability is concerned, where somebody has failed in a much more direct sort of way, where there's a very clear relationship between the omission, what the person did not do, and the thing that resulted from that, where it's clear, and any one of you know you have some people that are so hard to deal with, you can't get their attention unless you proceed to this. If you were interested in this particular thing, I would direct your attention to New York City, where they have, where in the many changes that have occurred in that city, they have hired about 20 lawyers, and they've put each one in a precinct so that a district commander has a lawyer on his or her staff. And they then use their lawyer to make use of the civil process rather than the criminal process to bring actions. And the actions might be to try to get, how many of you have dealt with the problem of trying to get a liquor license repealed and having to work through the city attorney, and it becomes a very torturous kind of process sometimes. Well, they've made the advice more readily available to the officers so that the lawyer is out in the field, can gather the evidence, and try to expedite those processes. But I could tell you that if the current trend is proceeding and the frustration in using the criminal law is as great, it continues to be as great as it is, that in a decade you're going to find police departments using the civil law as much as they use the criminal law to get things done. Any other questions? Yes. I'm sorry.
In reference to that, I don't remember what the city was, but they had a prostitution problem, and they went after the local motels. They went after the local motels that were allowing prostitutes to use it, and they started seizing the motel property.
Yes.
Like beds and furniture and things like that.
That
helped solve the problem.
You could, if we were sufficiently sophisticated, this is my world, this is my dream. My dream would be you run into a problem like that, and you just go on the net, and you try to define your problem, and you benefit from the work of police all over this country in dealing with the problem. And what you would find is that there are cities that have gone after the owners by seizing the property. There are cities that have gone after the owners by controlling the sale of the rental of rooms to eliminate what's called hotbeds, of renting them every 2 hours, and through ordinance regulations. There are cities that have there's a few other alternatives in the use of those properties, but a place like Seattle, which had a big strip of motels near their airport that was used for that, they've just totally reversed the proceeding by virtue of the pressures they brought to bear upon them. One of the most interesting, really problem-solving efforts had its origin in Oakland, and it's taken various forms where they've gone after drug houses. And what they did was they used a section of the California statute that enables citizens to go into small claims courts without lawyers, just bring evidence into the court that a house in their neighborhood is being used as a drug house. And there's a community organization that does this, and the police are just supportive. They're not doing it. So the community is taking ownership. And I've had the opportunity to accompany some people from this organization going into a neighborhood of San Francisco, having a meeting in somebody's living room, bringing together the neighbors who previously up to that night didn't know each other. And they're saying, we're being driven crazy by that house down the street. And then they're being instructed as to what they can do to bring a case against the owner of that house. And they're told, you collect all the needles that you find in the area, you report certain things to the police department, and you acquire all this evidence. And then they just do this as citizens, trained by these people. They go into small claims court without the attorney, and they petition to have the place abated. And the judge under California law can then give the landlord a period of time in which to straighten the whole thing out, or the place gets sold and the income from the sale gets distributed to the people who brought the petition. So there's a financial incentive. If you ever saw a good community organization method, I mean, these people who previously said, the law doesn't serve me in any way, the law doesn't protect me, all of a sudden, through their own efforts, the legal system has delivered for them. And they have renewed, faith in the system. They have now gotten to know each other, so you have a sense of community. The source of the problem has been eliminated, and they really, you talk about empowering a community. That's really a very effective thing. It's called the Safe Streets Program. It's a very effective method.
In that scenario, though, are you not really solving the problem as much as you are moving it to another neighborhood?
Okay, I'm happy you raised that. The term displacement is it's a conversation killer in policing. You say, you've got the prostitutes out of here, they're just over there. You've done this, the problem's over there. You've moved the drugs over there. We now have the benefits of about 15 studies of displacement. And by the way, in that connection, here I am talking within the context of a university, in the confines of a university. There's much more information research out there that is of benefit to police than we tend to get into the hands of police. And that's one of the things we have to address, is how can we better funnel this stuff. This is a good example. There's been lots of research on displacement. And it is not as clear a thing as a lot of us have assumed it to be in the past. If you get the robberies off the buses, they show up in the cabs or the underground, etc. The research essentially turns out several things. One is that when a problem gets displaced, it is rarely, in its displacement, is rarely in the same volume as where it was originally. So even though you may not have eliminated the problem, you will have reduced it a great deal. An example in drugs is there's a whole new insight with regard to the search factor in drug purchasing. And if you make it easy, if you have a drug bazaar, where people can come up and just buy whatever drugs they want, you're going to have a big problem. If you deal with that, and the sale of the drug moves elsewhere, and people have to invest more in searching for the drugs, the volume of drug sales goes way down. So one of the things we're finding in these things is that, yes, you've got to be alert to displacement. Sometimes there's a lot of it, sometimes there's very little of it, but rarely is the problem displaced in its entirety. The other thing is that there's another element which is called a diffusion of benefits. And that is sometimes when you deal with the problem in this way, it may be displaced, but not in the same volume, but you may have other benefits that come from what you put in place. Example, thefts in parking areas, structures. One of the techniques that we found, if you were in a police department, you say, we got a lot of thefts in this parking facility, one of the alternatives that has proved to be very effective is to arrange for some business operation that works on a 24-hour basis to have its office in that facility. So it's not just abandoned. So you have, if you got a fast food place in there and rented space to them, that would achieve it. Or you've got a cab company that has a dispatcher on duty 24 hours a day. So you create a small area where this person is headquartered, that's their office. The presence of that individual, the fact that it's populated in some way, will contribute to a reduction in the theft from the vehicles. But in that situation, there was also a diffusion of benefits in the sense that the fact that there was a live human being there had an effect upon a variety of other crimes that were occurring in the immediate area beyond just the theft of autos. So I commend to you, if you're exploring this particular problem, to hook into the rapidly increasing literature analyzing displacement. And my impression is it's not the problem that we have made it out to be. It's much less than that. But at the same time, I'm acknowledging people just don't go away. And a lot of people will continue to operate.
With respect to analyzing the extent of some of these problems, you mentioned it's primarily done at the beat level, sometimes at the precinct level. There are a few cities, maybe Chicago would be an example, where it's being done citywide.
Yeah.
Do you know examples where, particularly in this country, it's being done regionally or for a metropolitan area with a number of communities?
Mm-hmm. Not in this country. The example I cited this morning is perhaps it's the freshest one to come to mind because I've been involved in it, and that is where the British police have analyzed the relationship between two things, and that is repeat victimization and residential burglaries, auto thefts, domestic violence. And what they've concluded, first of all, nationally, that a high percentage of their crimes are crimes involving the same people as victims. So if they can address themselves to people who are repeatedly victimized, they might get at things. And they did that on an experimental basis in several forces, came up with such positive results that were confirmed and evaluated by academic researchers that it has become a national policy. That is, all the way up to the Home Office, where the Secretary of the Home Office has made it what they call in England a performance measure. The home, as you may know, the Home Office in England has some supervisory control over the 48 police departments. And so they have now said that one of your performance indicators is what you do about repeat victimization, because they are so convinced of the results of it. And there's now a manual that they produce that is written in a way that communicates to every police officer. It's so clean, so neat, so clear, in a persuasive sort of way, why they have to be concerned, so that when they respond to a domestic, a residential burglary, that they analyze what's there, and they have different degrees of responses depend upon whether it's the first, the second, the third, the fourth. Now, in the past, if I had my other chart up here, they were misleading the public. They'd have such a burglary, and they'd go there and they'd say, well, the person would be all shook up. Any police officer knows if their house has been invaded, especially an elderly couple, is this going to happen again? And they would tell them, in the past, they used to say, oh, lightning doesn't strike twice. Forget about it. Relax. Reality is it strikes twice, and 3 times, and 4 times in their situation. And so now, see, the value of this is, I'm happy you raised it because it makes the connection here, is in that situation, there's two problems. Well, one of the problems is you might end up in a situation in which you're blaming the victims. You're putting something on them. And that's bad in the context, especially of domestic violence and sexual assault. You're saying there's something you can do about your behavior, your situation, your house, to avoid this from happening, and that carries the message, it's your problem. So we have to avoid that. Now, in order to avoid that, what we're finding is that the role of information, and this again portrays the nexus between good policing, research, what this institution is all about, etc. If you could, the higher you go here, the more hard data and information you need. You're going into court, you're going to want to shift, you want to bring this case against somebody, you're going to have an ironclad case. So what that means is police have to gather this information. So in the context of repeat victimization, they have the research in which they can tell this person in a very effective way, without scaring them and without putting the blame on them, that we know that burglaries occur in this fashion, and what we would like to do here is A, B, C, or D. And their experience is that people welcome that and want to do what is appropriate in order to reduce the problem. So that's one example of that that I can cite.
I have 2 basic questions. First one.
Thank you.
Some article regard problem-oriented policing and community policing as identical approaches. Is there any distinction between those two approaches? My second question is Japanese policing in the context of problem-oriented policing?
What was the
Japanese policing.
What's the first part? I didn't get it.
First part is some articles say
I got
regard.
that.
Okay.
And the second one?
Is Japanese policing in the context of problem-oriented policing?
Japanese policing?
Yes, sir.
The first question is, that's something I have to live with. That it frustrates me a great deal when somebody says, well, there's no real distinction between community policing and problem-oriented policing. It goes back to the points I was making earlier, that I see an enormous difference between the two. Now, obviously, when you're involved in problem-oriented policing and you're focusing on the problem, at some point the community will probably have some involvement in this. It may or may not. I can cite you examples of problem solving where there was no community involvement whatsoever. But I think where the community gets involved in problem solving, it's again a tailor-made sort of thing, and you might have to organize this particular community. Then when that problem gets solved, they can sort of move back, and you might organize somebody else around a different problem. But for example, one of the classic examples of problem solving with no community involvement was theft of Social Security checks. This is for people, aged people in this country who get their checks from the government. When years ago when I worked in Chicago, they all came out on the same day. We used to put extra police officers on that day, anticipating all the calls that would come in from people whose Social Security checks were rifled when they were delivered to the mailboxes. People would just go and find them and cash them, and they'd be gone, and those people would go down. They knew which day they were expecting their Social Security check. They'd go down. They wouldn't find it there. They had to have a police report to go file their extra for their check. Well, we solved that by offering people the option of having their Social Security checks mailed to their bank. And we eliminated that whole thing. Now, that's a nice, clean response to the problem. It didn't involve, any major segments of the community or anything. You didn't have to organize people. So the point is, you can have lots of community policing and not ever get around to the problem solving. But I find that community policing sort of gets diluted if they don't have a problem around which to organize. And many police departments have been able to bring together people, get very excited when they've got a problem. Then when the problem gets solved, they can't get anybody to a meeting. So my feeling is the problem-solving business is sort of the meat between the buns. It's the heart of the thing. And that's why I place primary emphasis on that and then tie in some of the elements of community policing in support of it. Japanese policing, I know I've read a good deal about it and have worked with some Japanese police. I know it's very, very strong in terms of its community element and the kobans and the relationship with the people in the community. I'm not sure whether or not they are doing anything on the problem solving. I don't know.
Complex problems will sometimes require complex solutions, and complex solutions can involve multiple agencies, multiple groups, multiple actors. Sometimes these groups can be in cooperation, sometimes they can be in conflict. Can you give us some examples of each and maybe say something about conditions under which cooperation is more likely to emerge or conflict is more likely to emerge?
Mm-hmm. Well, what immediately occurs to me is one example of the ultimate in cooperation. In my own community, the police came to realize when they were analyzing problems on the South Side that many of them were not simply, Larry Sherman's hotspot phenomenon of a lot of things happening in a given address. They were happening within the same family. These were problem families. And so the police struggled with this for a while, and they took the initiative in getting the city government to agree to what they call a family enhancement program, where when things get so bad, and you've got 5 or 6 problems within the same family, that they staff it as a family problem. And the best way I can illustrate the response is they have gotten to the point where once a week there is a meeting at the police field station in the area that brings together the neighborhood police officer, the public health nurse, the counselor from the school, the social worker in the area, the parole agent in the area. There's one other. And they sit around a table and they have done some prior work and they staff the Smith family. You know, and what's going on with the Smith family and what we have done. I mean, that's a degree of coordination in bringing to bear response. And they agree upon a response. You know, how are we going to handle this thing? And everybody is informed. And they feel the time invested is well worth it, because otherwise each one of them are dealing with a piece of this problem and nobody is connecting. That, I think, is a very exciting sort of thing, which is the ultimate in, cooperation. Situations in where there's a lot of tension now, where, see, in some jurisdictions, police are so much into this stuff that, and it's creating such good PR for them and good vibes, that the other city agencies are resenting it, because they're saying, wait a minute, we have our own agenda for inspecting buildings, and if we let this thing go, the police department are going to be our bosses and telling us which buildings to inspect. So you get city agencies that become very resentful that their agenda is being defined for them by the police department. You get city administrators who are struggling with that, and they say, but what the police tell you to do, that's a good index of what needs to be done. And now there's sort of a movement to make the problem focus a problem of government rather than of just the police department. Because if it works for the police, it may as well work for city government. And I've been invited to participate in 2 programs, one in Baltimore County, where they brought together all the governmental agencies and said, look, this is what is happening at police, this is what is evolving, and we've got to think through ways in which to work this thing through, because the police are the foot soldiers of City Hall. They're out there, they see these problems, that's what people are concerned about, they're bringing them in, and you people have got to understand that, and then we have got to bring citywide responses to these problems. And if I can give you just one example, whoops, we're way past. One quick example here. Underage student drinking. 21-year-old, you ban it. They go, instead of being able to go to the bars, they now have parties in their houses. Police, if they're in a traditional role, will be put in the position of undercover operations, going in, getting the evidence, bringing charges of underage drinking. A frustrating business. The students are, haven't you got anything better to do and all that. We analyzed this in one community and said, what's the problem here? Is it really the underage drinking? And the problem was that we were having 150 kids in an apartment that housed 2 kids. But the 2 kids had become business entrepreneurs, were selling the beer, and they were inviting all these people to come in and have their beer there. So we thought about that. Well, what? The concern here, yes, you can get exercised about underage drinking, but the real issue was a building inspection issue, that the police were scared stiff that there'd be a fire there. And then they'd say, well, why hadn't you done something? Well, dealt with in the context of city government, okay, building inspectors, fire inspectors, this is being redefined. This is a fire problem, it's a building inspection problem, and the police will be back here to back you up, but we want you to take first call on it. We've run.
We've got to get Herman to the airport. Let's give him a hand and thank him for.
Thank you.